the deadliest pandemic in history and the lessons it left behind. As gruesome as it was, though, there were some positives. The Black Death helped end feudalism and gave rise to modern capitalism. It also had some surprising similarities to our own recent pandemic. It's me, and this is the Black Death in 60 seconds. So first off, what actually was the Black Death? Well, it was a bubonic plague caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and its primary victims were rats. See, these rats were living on trade ships coming into Europe from Asia. They had fleas which would jump onto humans and bite them, and the disease spread like wildfire. Within 2 years, it killed an estimated 25 million Europeans, about half the population. Historian O.J. Benedict explains how the trade routes supercharged its spread across the Mediterranean. You can see here along these major trade arteries is where the Black Death sort of took off and killed people in massive numbers. Some places hit harder than others. Here's a map showing the cumulative death toll from the Black Death across Europe. The worst hit area was southern England, and then France, and then Italy. But it reached all the way north into Scandinavia and east into Russia. But why did it kill so many? Historian Matthew Lewis points out that there were lots of contributing factors. First of all, this is medieval Europe, so sanitation is not really a thing. Cities are incredibly overcrowded. Because it's the Middle Ages, there's not much of a medical understanding of what's going on. So treatment is not really a thing either. The other thing is that at this time in history, rats are basically everywhere. They're living on ships. They're living in the streets. They're living in people's homes. So they had ample opportunity to spread the disease. And that brings us to one of the most famous images associated with the Black Death, the flagellants. These groups would go around whipping themselves as a form of penance, believing that if they could endure pain, God would spare them from the plague. Here you can see a group of flagellants at prayer. There's a whole library of medieval art depicting the Black Death, and a lot of it has to do with flagellants while whipping themselves. They were also spreading the disease even more because their wounds would become infected and they would infect other people. So that's great. Medieval medicine at its finest. Okay, but how did they try to stop the plague? One of the ways that they tried to stop the plague, according to historian O.J. Benedict, was quarantine. We have these really good records from the Italian maritime republics, places like Venice and Genoa, where they had entire fleets of ships that they would quarantine for 2 weeks before allowing them into port. Quarantine became a standard practice in the Mediterranean. And you can see here that the Venetian Republic created this cordon sanitaire, a quarantine zone around the entire city of Venice. If you came in on a ship from the east, you would go to one of these quarantine zones and stay there for 2 weeks. Sounds familiar? Yeah. In fact, when we think of quarantine today, we think back to the Italian quarantine. They really invented that concept. Now, while the quarantine and the flagellants might sound like superstitious nonsense, they did help slow the spread of the disease somewhat. But there was another factor that had an even bigger impact. See, the Black Death killed so many people that it led to a labor shortage across Europe. And this had some profound effects on medieval society, because under feudalism, most of the labor was done by peasants who were tied to the land. But with so many peasants dead, landlords had to offer better and better terms to attract workers. Historian Matthew Lewis says that this is one of the reasons why feudalism ended in Western Europe during this period. You can see here that manorial wages, meaning the wages that you would get if you were a peasant working the land, doubled in some areas after the plague, and that's just for agricultural work. Wages in the cities increased even more. This led to a situation where, according to historian R.H. Hilton, peasants were able to negotiate better housing, better food, better clothing, and were even able to leave the land and work in the cities. In fact, the Black Death is sometimes called the ultimate wage increase. This really helped transform medieval Europe, because it started the shift from feudalism to capitalism. Feudalism was all about fixed social orders, where your position was determined by birth, and your job was hereditary. Capitalism is more fluid. You not necessarily born into your social position, and you not necessarily going to die in that position. You can move up or down the rungs of society depending on your success. So the Black Death ironically helped set the stage for modern Europe by weakening the old order and giving rise to new ideas. But what does this mean for us today? Well, the Black Death is often compared to our own recent pandemic, COVID-19. Both diseases swept across the world, and both were caused by novel coronaviruses. COVID-19 has obviously not been as deadly as the Black Death, but the similarity is striking nonetheless. And it makes you wonder, could something like the Black Death happen again? Well, according to historian O.J. Benedict, there's no reason to think that something like the Black Death couldn't happen again. He says pandemics and plagues have been happening since the beginning of human history, and probably will continue to happen in the future. It's easy to forget that we've only been through one pandemic in the last 100 years. Before that, the last pandemic was the Spanish flu in 1918. Before that was the Asian flu in 1957. Before that was the Russian flu in 1889. And then, of course, you have the Black Death. Pandemics are nothing new. We'll continue to face them in the future. So what should we learn from the Black Death? Well, one lesson is that pandemics don't just affect people's health, they affect their economies and their societies. For example, while the Black Death devastated Europe's population, it also helped bring down feudalism and usher in the era of capitalism. Another lesson is that the way we respond to a pandemic can be just as important as the pandemic itself. For example, the flagellants didn't really do anything to stop the spread of the disease, but they did make it worse. On the other hand, quarantine was much more effective. And finally, the Black Death shows us that pandemics aren't just a thing of the past. We'll continue to face them in the future. So we should take every opportunity we can to learn about them. If you want to learn more about the Black Death, check out the additional resources. Thanks for watching.